Welcome to the church library. Draw up a chair and join us as we sort through these stacks of old books. I'm Marissa Burt.
And I'm Kelsey McGinnis. And here in the church library, we host conversations about popular Christian books. This season, we are dusting off Christian parenting resources.
Our book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families, examines many of these books, the obscure, the bestsellers, the ones that still pop up in church parenting classes.
Let's see what's on the bookshelves today. Hi, Marissa.
Hey, Kelsey. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. How are you today?
I am doing all right. It's officially summer here. Summer. Hot, sunny, summer things. What about you?
Yeah, same. We went to the Omaha Zoo yesterday. We're trying to fit things into the summer that we really want to do, because I find that once the summer gets going, some of those things keep on getting pushed down. So we're trying to fit some fun stuff in early, and so everyone's already exhausted.
Yeah, good. Started out right.
In a good way.
Well, thanks for joining us, listeners, too, here in the church library. We're glad you're with us today to talk about Gary and Anne-Marie Ezzo's Growing Kids God's Way.
Yes, Growing Kids God's Way. Now, if the Ezzo's name rings a bell to you, it may be because you're familiar with Baby Wise, which we talked about a couple episodes ago.
Yeah.
But we wanted to devote a whole separate discussion to Growing Kids God's Way because these resources, or I don't even know if you want to call them resources, these brands of resources that the Ezzos created have their own distinct flavor, their own distinct purposes and trajectory.
Yes.
And we will talk about all of that, but it sort of merits its own discussion.
It really does. And I tend to think this is one that people are on the front end of examining because it was super popular in the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. So I think children who were raised in those homes or older parents reflecting back are beginning to do that in the past few years just because of the timeline.
I think that's right. I was looking through a couple of the different, we'll talk about why there are so many different versions of resources in this brand, but I was looking through a couple of the ones that I have and was just reminded of how even though the Ezzos themselves sort of had a fall from grace in some places, the ideas in here are still very, very normalized. A lot of this, it sounds a lot like what you'd find in much less polarizing or controversial resources.
Yes. And I have a couple versions of the books as well, because since they were self-published, they've changed. They've edited them over the years and changed them. The titles have changed. Even the kind of titles of the ministries have changed. But we will refer to them as Growing Kids God's Way. And I think people who had different editions may not even be aware of the different groupings, right? If people picked up the On Becoming Baby Wise series, which goes all the way through On Becoming Teens, On Becoming Preteens, they are probably not aware of the Growing Kids God's Way parallel.
Right.
So there's a Christian, very Christian-y version. There's a very secular version, which is an interesting thing that I don't know if we've seen that from anybody else in Christian parenting resources. I mean, we have people like Dobson or John Rosemond who were able to reach both audiences, but they weren't necessarily producing two versions of their resources, one with Bible verses and godlike reasoning or godly reasoning, and one stripped of that with the same points.
Yeah. I think that's unique here. Now, before we get too ahead of ourselves, for people who did not listen to the Baby Wise episode or are not so familiar, let's give quick crash course in who the Ezzos are.
Yes, the Ezzos. Well, and if you're interested in more, I'm currently doing a deep dive on these resources, a little more in depth, looking at different chapters, and that is available on YouTube or social media. You can find it. But yeah, the quick brief recap is Gary and Anne-Marie started this ministry with the help of Grace Community Church, John MacArthur's church in Southern California. It grew exponentially with the help of those connections until it became a national and even international ministry, millions of copies sold. And at the peak of their ministry, they claim something like 70,000 families were attending weekly sessions at churches to learn this framework. So as I was rereading Growing Kids God's Way this week in preparation for this episode, it reminds me more of something like Bill Gothard's IBLP than some of the other standalone resources, because this is like a big notebook. There's homework, there's tests, there's a kids curriculum that matches, there's CDs and tapes, but it's all around these steps. And there's a lot of definitions and redefining things for people. So it really has that vibe where you are being catechized into a very particular framework, even more so than some of the other resources where you read the book and you kind of walk away with the idea. This is one where you are creating a community where everyone is kind of following this framework. Now, that's not to say that's what every family did, but I think a number of people who were all in on it did do that. So it was very immersive. In the early 90s, they started producing their secular parallel, and then medical physicians, pastors, and others began speaking out against the content and pointing out problems, which was very divisive. People were very loyal to this, again, similar to Gothard or Doug Wilson's community, where people who are all in see any critique as a defense, an attack that raises defenses both against the leader's reputation and their own choices. But it did kind of implode after John MacArthur came out and said Gary Ezzo was disqualified from leadership for domineering, unteachable nature. This was the second time that happened. Before they started their ministry, Gary had been asked to leave a church he was pastoring for those same reasons. And then he eventually was excommunicated a third time from a church for those reasons, which, as we'll get into it, makes a lot of sense when you read this authority-based framework that they were selling, like kind of an unchallengeable authority figures. So that's kind of the Ezzo's trajectory, but very popular. I'm not sure how many people, I do think people are still doing Growing Kids God's Way. There's an international ministry with like streaming classes. I don't know how many churches are still offering it as like part of their family life curriculum. I don't really have a sense of that. Do you?
I don't know either. So I have a 2008 edition of Growing Kids.
So that's pretty recent.
Way.
That's after the critiques came out.
Yeah. And on the back cover copy of the version I have, it says, Growing Kids God's Way curricula have been translated into 22 languages and have been taught in more than 10,000 churches across 25 denominations. Wow. Now, again, these are self-published resources. Right. There's no check on any of this information, so I don't know that we want to take their word for all of that. But I do think they have been very savvy in of rebranding, also finding new markets, and then sort of disappearing from like the public normie evangelical space, but continuing to market these resources selectively. And I think that's been relatively successful. They aren't super hard to find, but they're often under different names, or they've been redesigned to look differently. I also have, what year is this? They have a series called Let the Children Come. Let the Children Come series. And this is a 2002. And it's called Let the Children Come Along the Adolescent Way. And then there's like counterparts. Let the Children Come Along the Infant Way. Let the Children Come Along the Toddler Way. Now,
I think those were the precursors to the On Becoming series.
Yes.
Because that's how they're broken out.
Yes.
When you read these, at least when I read them, because this week I also compared to the On Becoming series, they kind of, from their original, because I have a very early edition of Growing Kids God's Way, which is very comprehensive, and subsequent resources basically just pull from that and tweak it a little bit, And so I do think you're absolutely right. They took their original content, refined it a little bit, but it doesn't change a lot, honestly. And then just tweak it for specific audiences. And I do think the On Becoming series did not carry as much critique because they had removed a lot of almost all of the religious language. So the only critique that was coming really was for the Baby Wise book regarding sleep and feeding, because
Right.
their older ones, they removed spanking. They removed some of the obvious things that would cause concern. I mean, there's still things to critique about it, but they're much more run of the mill. So I think those probably still circulate. It's just more scheduling, talking about success, talking about responsibility. I think they probably really appealed to people who liked like the Baby Einstein brand of like, how do you set your child up for, you know, educational achievement and to be good citizens in society, kind of successful moralism.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, it's an interesting one because they did something unique. They had a lot of reach. They disappeared from view. So even the international ministry they have now, there are other couples leading it, even though Gary and Anne Marie are still recognized as the founders and it's still their materials. So I imagine it's still pretty profitable, but yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine so too. And like I said, like if I were just at a used bookstore and picked this one up, the one that I have, Let Children Come Along the Adolescent Way, I wouldn't know any of those connections to like the back cover copy does not mention Baby Wise at all. You know what I mean? Like it's not on there. There's no the authors of Baby Wise, right? Like, and that was a really successful book. So they've wiped that from all of this so that when people go searching, unless they know to look for it, it won't be there. They do put the fact that Anne Marie Ezzo authored a book called Birth by Design. She is a childbirth instructor.
Oh, interesting. She was a nurse originally, so maybe that became later.
Yes. So I think there's probably an interesting connection there to some like crunchy natural birth kind of anti-pediatrician stuff in there, I would guess. Some reasons,
but they're interesting because they lean heavily into the medical sphere, so they may be surprising in that way, you know.
Yeah. I do think it's a really interesting study to sort of look what they've done with these books to try to keep them on the market. And we'll talk about, I mean, there's a lot to talk about here, but
there is.
So we will, let's see, where do we want to start, first of all? Do we want to start with, oh gosh.
Well, I think it's worth noting as we're looking at our outline here to see where to start that we hear from a number of adult children raised by Growing Kids God's Way. I haven't heard from that many parents who used it. And I don't know if that's because we just haven't connected yet or they aren't reevaluating yet because of the ages, but I have heard from adult children who are beginning to parent, and many of the same dynamics we talk about with a lot of these resources show up here, with extremes regarding spanking, extremes regarding authoritarianism, high expectations for perfection for children, difficulty cultivating authentic relationships as adults. And as we always say with these resources, we are looking at the primary sources. So it's hard to know how individual families applied this or whether parents mitigated it or whether it was exacerbated. But the ingredients here really add up to a very authoritarian framework with high moralistic expectations. I think that's the word I would use to sum this up. They refer to it a lot, but it's almost, I think they're probably pretty reformed, but it's almost the opposite of some of the total depravity ones you read that are talking about vipers and diapers and babies like with no hope for being good. They do use that sin language, but they have these high expectations that children will be able to achieve a kind of moral perfection and should. That's right. And they apply it in interesting ways that feel very unique to their framework. So they care a lot about like table manners and calling adults by the Mr. and Mrs. or standing up for the aged. What was interesting in comparing resources is to see what they took out of later resources and what they kept in. And these are all still really foregrounded in all their resources. So I think there's something there where they're very concerned with respect for parental authority, respect for the marriage, So yeah, let's start there. Let's start with what they have to say about authority. Things like couch time and making an appeal and all of this kind of thing.
Yes. And before we go there,
Oh,
I just
sure.
want to read out of the introduction of this. So this is the leader's guide that I have to Growing
Mm.
Kids God's Way. And in the introduction, they have a little, they start it with exactly what you were describing. They say, we serve an ethical God.
Mm.
Moral rightness flows from his being. His ways are in accord with his unchangeable character. In short, God is absolutely perfect, and his moral law is a reflection of his holy character. The Bible provides with certainty the ethical standards necessary for successful living. With
Hmm.
these standards comes a clear moral mandate for parents. Practical holiness is not merely a state of mind, but a lifestyle, a moral lifestyle established by God. So this is interesting to me. We have a whole chapter in our book about sort
Hmm.
of the humanness of children and the application of ethical frameworks to their treatment. They love the terms moral and ethics,
Yes.
but their understanding of morality and ethics is inseparable from their idea that all of that flows from scripture, like
Hmm.
from like biblical understanding of morality.
Yeah.
There is no external framework you can use to get
Right.
there. So on the surface, you're sort of like, oh, interesting. I see like they've used ethical like three times in this very first the very
Hmm.
first paragraphs of this introduction. But what they're talking about when they talk about ethics is something very particular.
I think so. And this one, a lot of self-published resources have so many words, right? Which I say without casting shade because we had to cut like 30,000 words. It is hard to edit.
Yes.
But this manual, I was trying to, as I read it, envision what that would be like as a parent looking for advice. And I
Mm.
think it can be really misleading to think that this is a very intellectually rigorous, kind of like Gothard's. There's a lot of homework for you to do, which can feel like, as a result, oh, good, I'm with someone who takes this seriously. They're defining their terms, and they do. They do. They offer some history of parenting movements that are revealing, and they are it's a flood of information that parents are
Yes.
receiving and being tested on and having to, write homework on and fill in the blanks on. So their very is an all-encompassing thing. They do a lot of either ors and double talk. And I think what you've pinpointed is one of those, because they have a whole section in the beginning of their books where they, at least the Christian ones, where they talk about the difference between something being unbiblical and something being non-biblical. So they kind of are splicing this out and saying there are
Mm.
parenting philosophies that are explicitly unbiblical, and they would point to like child-centric attachment parenting as that, like that's unbiblical. And then they say there are things that are non-biblical. So there's freedom. They don't use the word freedom. I agree with that. There are things that the Bible doesn't speak to, right? And I think this is where you see the biblical counseling nouthetic exhaustion coming in. I was exhausted. I wrote that on like multiple pages. Like, this is exhausting. But they are, though. So on the surface, that sounds pretty good, right? That sounds balanced. But then they have multiple hundred pages here to tell you the correct way to do the things, both that what the Bible says and the quote non-biblical things. So I think it overall has this confusing effect where if you're reading it, you get the sense that it's being measured, but when you complete the whole thing, you have really come under Gary Ezzo's authority to tell you, and you are going to feel guilty if your child talks to an adult and doesn't use Mrs. Burt, or something.
Mm.
So I would imagine it would kind of be even more the case in a whole community that was all in on that. And they do in later editions talk about that, seeking out communities that will reinforce your values and morals for your family. And that is something we heard from a number of people whose families were in this. Their parents became coaches. All their friends were other Growing Kids God's Ways families. So then I think you have a really top-down delivery of what Christian family life looks like. So it's an interesting one because I could see someone picking it up external from all of that and maybe or maybe not reading the whole thing and being like, okay, well, this is a little bit more measured than some of the other ones, but whoo, by the time you're finished with it, you're like, wow, that was a lot.
Yeah. Well, it does, they do something similar to what Ted Tripp does in Shepherding a
Mm,
Child's Heart, where it's sort of like every aspect, there is sort of there's an explicit decision you need to make in almost
yes.
every moment of life to turn toward God or toward an idol. Like
Yes.
everything
It's
is
either
this
or.
binary choice. And they kind of come at that from with language that sounds, like you said, it sounds measured on the surface. But then when you start digging down into how much how much pressure they put on everything from table manners to
Yes.
parents having a certain amount of time to talk to each other. It's like, oh, you think that every one of these moments of life needs to be, they talk about, we offer practical steps to implement God's moral precepts into the life of
Yeah.
children. Good theology, if it is not fleshed out into everyday rubber meets the road stuff, is just that, good theology and nothing
Right.
more. So there's this we're going to give you this theology that
Mm.
can be applied with these scripts every moment,
Yes.
every decision, every time you need to interact with your children almost.
Yeah.
You
And
are
yeah,
implementing this.
and it's exhausting for everyone. There's an anecdote they relate in across all the resources, which is hey guys. So this anecdote they relate is, I think it's Gary writing, and he's talking about a moment where he's in a room of crowded people and an elderly man walks in, and he's trying to break down his thought process. Basically, like, does he give up his seat for the elderly person? But the way he describes it is he's like, you kind of have like a moral storehouse in your mind, and whatever you've put into that moral, like, filing cabinet is what's going to prompt your behavior. So if over the course of your childhood and life, you've put in these moral lessons that are respect for the aged and these Bible verses, then when someone walks in, it's going to ping your moral compass to go to the filing cabinet, pull that out, and act accordingly. So it's this very belabored process of, yes, respect for the aged, the end, but the anecdotes have that. And then what's intimated is that parents will be doing that when they teach their children. And so they do say that, where they critique instant obedience culture partway. Again, they have a lot of these partway things where they're distinct. They still hold to instant cheerful obedience, but they call out, it's almost a straw man. They call out other parenting resources that call for instant cheerful obedience for saying, well, that's just blind obedience. You're not explaining to your children why. And you need to really explain to your children why whenever possible, which, again, on the surface sounds kind of appealing. But when you hear the belabored reasoning, you're like, oh my gosh, every moment of discipline then is going to include a little sermonette, which reminded me a lot of Ted Tripp as well, and made me wonder if this is the fruit of the biblical counseling milieu that though a number of these resources are coming from. And I did wonder that at several points too, because they write with such unsourced authority. So they're writing about everything from their ideas about child development to different anthropologies and different worldviews, and even how parenting has developed over the years. But it's coming across all very authoritative, but no sourcing in the Growing Kids God's Way books. There's some sourcing in the Baby Wise books that has come under critique because it's kind of wild how they source things. So, but it made me wonder, did the Ezzos just make all this up? Is this all their thoughts, or were they pulling from biblical counseling exhaustive charts, as Ginger Hubbard does or Martha Peace does in their resources? I'm not sure, but it had that flavor.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I mean, I think knowing that a lot of this was developed, at least some of these ideas were developed while they were at John MacArthur's church, I think we can probably safely assume that some of these ideas are coming,
I think
if not
so.
from John MacArthur himself, from the family life teaching that circulated in that church.
Right. And the people like Lou Priolo, who gets cited in a lot of these resources, who were big names at that time, writing about like the Nuthetic view of the heart or sin or idolatry. And I think the Ezzos kind of take those ideas and talk about them in terms of morals and ethics and raising responsible, successful children, versus Ted Tripp talking about maybe a more spiritual, devotional approach of end goal, like understanding their heart so they can connect with God. The Ezzos are kind of like understand their heart, catechize their heart so they can be good people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I had made a note to myself on the John MacArthur front.
Yes.
To note something, because I don't remember if we've talked about it on the podcast or just on social media, but John MacArthur went kind of viral for comments he made about neurodivergence and ADHD recently, about those things being either just overdiagnosed or even made up in some way. That shows up in here. So this along the adolescent way, I read this and I was like, oh, this is the same kind of thinking, but this is in 2002 or now 2024, I think was when he made those comments, John MacArthur. But he writes about, this is on page 38 of the book that I have. We hear about so many psychological syndromes and disorders. They list a bunch: ADHD, children's bipolar, et cetera, et cetera. Today, when the psychologist is high priest, parents often feel that whatever strange behavior their teen exhibits must be the result of some neurosis or chemical imbalance. Beware of looking for labels to justify misbehavior. We feel that it's too much to lump every occurrence of antisocial behavior into the category of psychological disorder. The bottom line is that it's a moral choice. If we choose to forget that, even the most bizarre explanations become acceptable. So, and then they go on to talk about how, like, probably the root of most of these is poor sleep. Which I was like, oh, we're going to go back to the sleep training thing now.
Yes.
Right? Everything comes back to sleep with these people.
True. It's so true. And the promises they've made, which again, those promises, I think, probably were really frustrating for people who maybe did sleep train, or their kids were, you're constantly pulling this lever of like, what is it going to be if the standard is this kind of moral good behavior, and for whatever reason a child is not able to achieve that in the way that a parent expects or the community expects. That's really interesting that they bring back sleep.
Yeah, it comes back around to sleep. And I thought, oh my goodness, first of all, this is like very similar to John MacArthur's rhetoric around diagnosis and neurodivergence, and just sort of not trusting that what psychologists are telling us is real, right? Like there must be some moral failure here underneath all these diagnoses. And then to bring it back around to sleep, we didn't talk in depth about that this time around, but a huge feature of BabyWise was, if you sleep train starting at a couple weeks old, not only will your child sleep through the night, you will have begun the very important process of instilling in them respect for your authority, right? Like it's the earliest way you can train your child to respect your authority,
and
is
have
by
self-control.
exerting, and have self-control is by exerting your authority over their sleep and over their eating habits. And they kind of conveniently get to bring that back around now in this book about teens. When, your child was diagnosed with ADHD and ADD, they're not behaving the way you want them to. You might not have been training them correctly and getting them the sleep they need and asserting your authority. There's this like 1-2 punch. They're able to just bring it back around and kind of give a gentle, like not even gentle, a subtle "I told you so" in there.
Yeah, I think so. Well, and that all tracks with, of course, Jay Adams and the Nuthetic movement itself, which was skeptical of psychology and still trickles down, particularly at this time in the biblical counseling movement, that would say everything's a sin issue. It's a moral issue. It's something that the Bible can speak to. So those external sources of, even if you want to call them theories or ideas about behaviors, just would not be welcome. So you don't see these frameworks accounting for them at all. They're going to say, I think the Ezzos even identify it as a one-size-fits-all parenting. I wrote that in the deep dive. I'll touch on that because they, more than anyone, kind of say, no, this is it. So there doesn't need to be a different way, which is why I think, this is my theory, because I've wondered, how did they justify going all in on this is God's way, here are the Bible verses supporting it, this is biblical, how did they then justify printing pretty much the same framework as just secular advice? And I really think underlying it is their idea here about something being either unbiblical or non-biblical. So I think they really believe this is God's way for every child. Therefore, even if we don't support it with Bible verses, it will benefit families. You know, and a couple of those resources, they have a little appendix at the end that kind of is a gentle, like, we think your parenting will be better with God at the center, and encourage you to look into that. They kind of give not really a invitation or altar call or something like this, but they do in a couple of them explain that they're writing from a Christian framework and gently encourage people. But it's interesting because there's nothing else in it. Everything is about success and setting up your child to be successful in school and successful in their job and responsible. And I don't know, even they change some of the terminology. Instead of talking about the difference between foolishness and childishness, which they use in the biblical one, they talk about childishness and, what is it? Like rebellion or something. They pick different terms. They take out chastisement, which is big in Growing Kids God's Way. And in one of the resources, it almost comes across as like anti-spanking even. It's very strange. And I don't know if their editors made that choice or if they just were savvy enough to know, because that's something we talk about. They do talk about corporal punishment as an important ingredient, as the godly way. I will give them a bone because they do point out that the Bible never mandates it. They actually accurately identify that, I think, in my opinion. But they do say, look, we do think because it shows up in the Proverbs that this is a wise method to use. So they, like Ginger Hubbard and Ted Tripp, say your discipline should be verbal correction and then corporal punishment. They also note that discipline is a broad concept, biblically speaking. So there were some moments when I was reading this, I was like, okay, they are do something different than a lot of these other resources. But then they, of course, go on to present spanking as the way. And they make the promise you've observed before. Like if you spank early, you'll probably be done with it by 40 months. So spank early, spank often, and then you don't need to do it anymore, kind of. And they say use a tool, and they give examples of tools to use. So they really, it's a strange thing. I think it felt like a lot of mixed messages to me as I was reading it, with admittedly very critical lenses to be looking for, to be analyzing this resource. But I wonder how that fell on parents, because even though they're saying all of these double messages, where they're landing is, you need to find a flexible switch to spank with, you know?
Yeah. Ugh.
So.
Yeah, I have not read in full. I have not read Baby Wise, but I do think it is interesting about the Ezzos how willing they are to be flexible with their advice in order to meet the market that they need to meet. And I do wonder if that comes in part from their publisher.
Yep.
You know, one of the things, I mean, if we could probably do a whole like deep dive on this process and go and try to track down the full story of what happened as the Ezzos were trying to move into a more mainstream market. Because like you said, it's very clear that most of these did not have an editor. The ones that are self-published, it's like there was no accountability for any of this.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to me the kind of disappearance of corporal punishment and the softening of certain things that just sort of belies this like confidence that they seem to have that this is the best way, this is God's way, no apologies, that, you know, they temper it when they have to.
They do. And some of that, I wonder if it shows some flexibility. Maybe they were growing and changing their ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Later editions include a chapter, for instance, on play and the importance of play developmentally, which surprised me, right? That doesn't show up in the first ones, but even later editions of the Growing Kids God's Way. And then it's an opening chapter in the On Becoming books. So it's interesting to think of how other things may have reverse influenced it. If they had an editor at, I think Multnomah published their On Becoming series originally, if they had an editor there who helped guide them and then they decided to adopt that, re-edit their older Growing Kids God's Way resources, it's a little bit unclear, but it's interesting. And then, so their trajectory, this I do know about their trajectory. They did mostly self-published all the way through. Multnomah picked them up for the Baby Wise series. Then when the controversy happened, there was a little kerfuffle. Multnomah eventually dropped them. And someone who worked in the sales department, I think, at Multnomah left the company and ended up helping them self-publish going forward. So they had some maybe collective vision for how to move forward and maybe some industry insight. So it's so unclear which was chicken egg kind of thing. But maybe they also changed some of their viewpoints along the way. But most of it is pretty consistent and they never retracted anything to my knowledge. So even if they removed some things in the secular resources, I don't think that necessarily means they had changed their mind about spanking. Interestingly, they do add into the Growing Teens, the On Becoming Teen Wise, they have a chapter with flavor of purity culture. They kind of suggest courtship as a model, which I thought was interesting after our conversation with Dr. Camden last week. And interesting that they introduce it to secular audiences. They kind of do it the way the Duggars did on their show, of saying that they both dated as young people and found it wasn't very helpful, and courtship is more like dating with a purpose. So it was interesting to see some of the things from the era pop up in these resources too.
Interesting. Not wholly surprising.
Right.
A lot of common ground between kind of like purity culture-y books and Christian parenting books. But go back and listen to our conversation with Dr. Camden on that, because that was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, it was. It was good. Yeah, and there's one other purity culture thing they said where I thought it was interesting. They say to parents, in a sense, your child is already married. They're talking about young children. So in a sense, they're suggesting that parents should think of the fact that their child will have a spouse someday, and think about their child being committed to that spouse already. So to think, which struck me as very odd, like pretty heavy into the purity culture thing, the kind of your child belongs to their future spouse. Therefore,
but that's not gender. They're not saying that specifically about daughters. They're saying it about both.
Both.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Which was interesting. So yeah, they have some things that pop up and you're like, knowing the context, these raise all kinds of flags of what was that like within the community. If they're willing to float this to a broad audience in a very measured way, I'm assuming things like purity culture were pretty heavily into these communities.
Interesting.
Okay. What else?
Oh, well, I marked a place in one of my books about going to professionals. One thing we talk about in our book is that there is just general distrust, right, of like mainstream psychologists. And there was that line I shared earlier about in our modern society, the psychologist is the priest. There's this absolute fear of this. And this is very on brand for the Ezzos. They write at one point in here, this is again on their book for adolescents, raising adolescents. And this is after they talk about, these things are probably overdiagnosed. Before you get them a little white pill, do all these things. Like, are they sleeping? Have you done, They even talk about, nutrition. Like, is your child eating Twinkies and Taco Bell? They kind of, moralize about diet. And then they go on and say, okay, if you have a problem that you can't seem to find the root cause with your, diet and sleep and all of this, You don't necessarily need to go to a professional, they write. This is a quote. Parents who have successfully guided their teens through situations like this are your best therapists. Before you spend any money, find someone in your church or community who has already been where you are.
Hmm.
And this is very consistent with their experience, right? Like as they were developing Baby Wise and this Growing Kids God's Way, in the context of just like parents sharing wisdom in these Bible study like settings, there's really this sense that like mainstream psychologists are not on our side. In our community, in Christian communities where we value these things, we believe these things, our community has a way of raising children. You need to find the people who are raising children the way you know that you're supposed to raise your children. And those are going to be your best, quote, therapists. Like there's this very insular idea that the community does not just discipleship, not just serving, but like therapy. does your group counseling, does your problem solving for you. And for the most part, except in extreme circumstances, most problems that your child or you and your child are going to face should be solved in the context of that community. It's very what I would imagine in like much more kind of closed communities. It's that kind of thinking. Like these problems should be solved within the context of our community culture and our faith culture, because what's outside of it is going to give you answers that are counter to what we're trying to accomplish here.
Yes. And so it would be another way of reinforcing the message, and also would, prevent people from getting maybe an alternate perspective. And we did hear from adult children whose parents had been coaches, and often there was very much a behind closed doors difference. But I think, which makes sense, it tracks with this standard of moralism, because the expectations were high for entire families to be well behaved. So I wouldn't say that they're encouraging families to put on a show, but I do think that's the end result, is families are going to be very well behaved. So for some children reflecting back, they were always very confused that here were their parents kind of pedestaled to offer advice to other parents when they saw parents who were out of control or who were raging or, this sort of thing at home. And I imagine there wasn't a lot of accountability for that, who was coaching and what kind of advice they were offering. It's hard to say if it was just kind of like IBLP if parents had gone through this training and seminars and conferences a number of times, then they became coaches. That is really interesting. A couple of things I wanted to note directly from their teaching is this, again, like I said, this kind of exhaustive exploration, because they set up kind of principles. For instance, they have a whole chapter on respect for peers, property, and nature. And there's a long section on respect for private property, which I think parallels a lot of conservative Christian books on economics or politics. So interesting to see little flavors of that sprinkling throughout. But it's from this discussion of respect from private property that they kind of build into what the offenses you need to discipline for are. And they are, of course, things like stealing, but it's also things like gossip, because that is stealing somebody's reputation, the property of their reputation. So that kind of layered thinking reminded me a lot of redefined terms in things like IBLP, and made sense given the loyalty to Gary, despite a number of people speaking out against his domineering behavior. It shuts down things like gossip and says, no, this isn't just gossip or slander. This is stealing my reputation. It's one of the grievous things someone can do, I think he says at one point, not about himself, but gossip is, and lying is stealing truthfulness. So it's interesting how they get there. I think, again, it has the appearance of being really like inked in stone or whatever, carved in stone, because it's so, like, I just think it would, after a while, you're just too tired to think critically about it because it's such a fire hose. But then they link to children's behavior, kind of like Ted Tripp. They are evaluating motives, and they say the type of correction depends on the presence or absence of evil motive. And they go on to say things like tantrums. Children throw temper tantrums for two reasons: blackmail and revenge. Right? So you say, this is on page 193. Little Stevie blackmails his mother into submission with temper outbursts. He has found this to be an effective method of control, especially in public. And then I think he goes on to say, does he give an example of revenge tantrum? Now, they also parse out that frustration tantrums are something different when a child, kind of can't accomplish what they want to. But it's unclear how parents are, at least in this manual, no advice is given for how to make that distinction. Is this blackmail? Is this revenge? Or is my child frustrated? And then there's things like this, just to give a sampling. He says, lying, the ultimate family sin. Everyone lies, both adults and children. And he quotes Psalm 58. The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies. That means man is not a liar because he lies, but he lies because he is a liar. One of the 6 abominations listed in Proverbs 6 is a lying tongue. Proverbs 12:22 states, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. Lying is an insidious and grievous sin, destroying all certainty. It attacks and destroys the bridge of confidence and trust, linking each family to the others. Weaken one link, and you weaken them all. And again, he lists some motives for lying: to get attention, to gain control, to get revenge, to escape responsibility, to get accepted, to balance out appearance unfairness because of parental example. And I say all that to give kind of an example of how just heavy-handed this all is. Like, I think most parents would agree, yeah, we want to address lying if a child's lying, but the escalating scale of the scriptures, the sin flattening that's happening here, where everything is equivalent to abominations to the Lord, estranged, wicked from the, like this level, plus all this many messaging about evil motives, blackmail, the stakes with private property, the stakes with the reputation of the family. It's just a lot. It's a really burdensome kind of teaching, I think, for the people who ingested all of it and took the tests, the fill in the blank charts that were very aligned to exactly what they were saying. Like, I wish I could show a visual of some of the test charts in the back of the original resource, because it really is this kind of web of fill in the blanks. It's not, did you walk away with a general sense? It's, did you understand the flow of thought that Ezzos were pointing out?
Interesting. This brings me back to my theory about this, like, this extreme language of, like, evil, revenge, blackmail. It's like ascribing these very adult motives to child behavior, like these sophisticated concepts of how that would even work. I mean, obviously a child doesn't know the term blackmail, but they also don't really know how blackmail works, right? So it's ascribing these very adult motives. And I think partly so that parents feel justified in coming down on it kind of however hard they want to, right? Like if we can call it evil, if we can kind of like almost attribute it to this evil nature within our children that isn't even our children, it's the enemy, then like you can come down on it as hard as you want to, physically or emotionally. Or you are justified in being just so angry. Like that anger is a righteous anger. Like R.L. Stoller writes about this in Kingdom of Children, about how parents feel more justified when they can kind of parallel their anger with God's, right? Like if their anger is a righteous anger, they can feel free to kind of let that anger fly, and that anger is in fact a correct response to their child. And this kind of language gives license to that. It encourages parents to feel that way toward their children. And that makes me sad, because if the reality is that it's a much less clear and more developmentally appropriate behavior, that
Right.
anger doesn't have a place to, it means you need to kind of like deal with it in yourself and
Right.
not point it toward your, which is a harder answer.
It's a harder answer. And unfortunately for Christian parents, I think it's such a missed opportunity for maturity
Mm,
because, of course, I'm sure it feels good. We've all been there with the embarrassment of a public tantrum or the frustration. And I think it probably is really soothing to think, my child's the villain here. They're trying to
mm,
blackmail me. They're trying to manipulate me. How dare they? You know, you can kind of see that trajectory, even though the Ezzos are not using emotional terms. They're tapping into something that's a familiar emotion. And it's unfortunate because the harder path, I think, is the invitation to long suffering, to patience, to practicing that, to being gentle with those who aren't keeping up in quite the way we want them to, like as fast or as competent or as swiftly obeying, or to being merciful to their need. Like, so it's interesting to think of the way those really crisply defined, here are the 6 motives it could be, and it's up to you, parent, to parse those out and discipline accordingly, really sets up, of course, unchecked authority, but also a framework where parents never learn to practice relationship that takes their children as persons into account in a meaningful way that I'm sure parents feel like it requires a lot from them to do this kind of endless disciplining, but that requires the kind of character development in a parent that then down the road will be able to perceive a child's difference or different perspective on something. And that's something we talk about with a lot of these resources, that they're short-sighted in that they may quote unquote work for young years when parents can control children, whether through coercion or bodily threat or compliant children. But at a certain point, the proof is in the pudding a little bit. Like, what you have practiced will bear fruit. And I think families end up at this like crossroads, and it's almost a standstill for parents who have only ever practiced, I'm the parent, I'm the authority, I understand what's going on in your mind and heart and your motivations. And when you contradict my authority in any way, I perceive your motivations to be the problem here. And it's mystifying to me because, similar to Ted Tripp, the Ezzos have a chapter where they talk about letting go. And like Ted Tripp, they kind of say, look, when your child gets married, that's where they place it. They should cleave to their husband or wife, and they're out from under parental authority. But it left me wondering, because the clear messaging throughout the book is your children will grow up to be these successful people in the
mhm.
ways you've envisioned. And so there's no discussion of like how that letting go looks like. Maybe your children go in a direction you don't want them to or something. It's only kind of like, well, you will let go, but it will be okay because you've done this all so right that they
Yeah.
will be these successful, moral, godly adults. So it's nice to see the verbal like expression of parents, you will need to let go, because some of these resources never even get there. But I wonder how that actually plays out, because even in the introduction, Ezzo goes, he quite clearly says it takes 2 generations to turn a country around, turn a nation around. I mean, very much of Dobson. So he's like, we've got 2 generations to kind of implement these ideas and get our country back on track.
There you go. We're back around to parenting as a social project. You know,
It is
this is
from it's very, in the early edition, that disappeared from some of the later editions, but in the early edition, and it made me laugh because, as we've pointed out with John Rosemond and others before, it's always a moving target because, you
Mhm.
know, Dobson is saying that message and pointing back to the parents of the 50s and 60s. Here comes Ezzo saying that message and saying, look, the parents in the 70s and 80s were too soft, right? This is the parents Dobson was speaking to. So I'm not sure how those who were daring to discipline were too soft, but they're always pointing at the less authoritarian parenting frameworks to
Yes, that's
say,
right.
They're too soft. They're the problem for all the social problems we have. And if we can just get the authority structure right, everything will be good, not just for your children, not just for your family, but for the country.
Absolutely. Yep. Man, they all love that. They all
Yeah.
love that theme so
No
much.
matter how much evidence shows it's not working, at the very
Oh,
least.
man. They're just, yeah, they're convinced that the right parenting will right the ship of America, just
Yeah.
right the course. Yeah,
Yeah.
man, I'm amazed at how often that comes back in these books. And
It
like
does.
Chuck Swindoll and Dobson, and it's also not lost on me that a lot of the people writing along those lines are in California.
Yeah,
Like
that's interesting, right?
Dobson, Swindoll, Ezzo's, they're all kind of
MacArthur, yeah.
watching. They all kind of feel like they're writing from like this moral cesspool, and I think that adds to the tone of panic in some of their writing in some ways,
Yeah.
which I'm sure there's more to be said about that, but that does strike me as interesting as well.
Yeah, it is. And I wish we could interview someone like the Ezzos. I know they don't give interviews or anything, but part of their trajectory is it was pretty publicly known that all of their adult children were estranged from them for a time. I don't know how long that lasted.
Hmm.
I don't know if that was a part of why they ultimately stepped back, but it would be interesting to know how they perceive their message given that. Like, is it their children had evil motivations? Was there self-reflection there that this message that they had so clearly outlined for millions maybe didn't have the kind of fruit that they had anticipated when they were writing it?
Oof.
I don't know. I'd be curious to know, because that is the piece that whenever we talk about older resources that families are dealing with the wreckage over, you don't know. Often we'll say the experts never have accountability for this, but I think this is a case where they did at least some family accountability and some collective accountability, but not enough to pull or retract anything. So
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I forgot about the estrangement. That
Yeah.
is interesting to me because on the books of theirs that I have, they always put on there that they have 8 grandchildren. They mention the
Yeah.
grandchildren.
Yep.
So that's an important part of their identity
Important
to
part of,
them.
yeah. Well, and I think for some of the writing of their children were still involved and around, but um then also for a while Anne Marie blogged about not seeing her grandchildren, so it's a little unclear. And of course there are privacy issues there, but it's a waffly line, right? Like if you've
Mhm.
platformed yourself and your children and your grandchildren and all these resources as testimony to your methods, then you kind of have forfeited privacy. Hopefully not in a gross way, but kind of like, yeah, the people who followed along with this kind of deserve to know if that promise held. And the same thing with one later edition I have, Growing Kids God's Way. They have all these sidebars with glowing quotes from children and like young teenagers about how wonderful it is. And you kind of wonder what those teens would say now and how this has worked out for a number of people. And I imagine for some, as with all of these resources, it was a blip, or it was not a problem. Like sometimes we hear from people who say, I think we got a comment even on our last Baby Wise episode of like, don't feel sad for me. This worked out in my family. So, maybe there are people who it worked out just fine for, or they mitigated it in different ways. But we also hear from a number of people that is really not the case.
Yeah. Well, and we tried really carefully in our book not to make it about the personal lives of the people who've written these books, right? Like we try to kind of take their words and look at what's underneath those words in terms of ideas and beliefs. But in the case of the Ezzos, I do think it's worth at least mentioning these things about their personal lives, partly because of the way that they think parenting advice works. They make it very explicit. Go and seek out parents whose children were, quote, successful.
Yes.
And those are your best resources. And so they have this library of resources that they continue to sell on the assumption that, well, parents who've done it the way that you should do it and done it successfully, those are your best resources. They set themselves up that way in the midst of having these relational issues both in their church communities and in their own family.
Yeah.
And that just, at the very least, should give us pause, because their own message doesn't hold up in their own personal lives, and they either are unwilling to acknowledge it or are just blind to it.
Yeah.
And it's sad.
Yeah.
And, I don't say that with sort of like a "I told you so" or with any smugness, but just with it's just hard. It's just hard. And they have every reason to try to continue with their brand because it's their business and their livelihood. But their message isn't holding up in their own context, in their own communities. And that's hard.
It is. And it makes it the last thing. I know we're wrapping up here. There are two pieces of it that I feel like are recurrent. We hear from people, and that's couch time, which we talked about in Baby Wise. It's this idea that the parents need to sit on the couch every night for 15 minutes, only looking at each other and engaging each other. And this should be within eyesight of the children. And the children are taught not to interrupt, right? To underscore the primacy of the marriage relationship. And similarly, they have a unique concept called making appeals, where they say if a child disagrees with your decision, they have one chance. They can say, "May I make an appeal?" And they can kind of appeal that they have like a little process that you have to teach how to do it. And if they make the appeal in the right way, maybe you'll change your mind. But if you don't, the child needs to accept it, right? And these are kind of like staples. And we heard from people raised in these homes, these are things they remember, right? These are scripts that I think were core ingredients. And with this, when they're explaining the primacy of the marriage relationship, which I think is pretty common in a lot of resources, Christian and secular alike will say, there's stability from the caregiver relationship. Christian resources will point back to the importance of marriage in the garden. And the Ezzos do this in a really unique way to me, where they point out that because God says it is very good when it's just man and woman, that precludes the existence of children. And they're not saying children aren't good, but they're saying there's something especially good just about the husband-wife relationship without children involved, which is interesting to me because if you look at like Roman Catholic theology, for instance, they see the Trinity mirrored in man, woman, and child, right? They see something inherently good and the image of God in the way that man and woman together create children, and that's an outflowing of the love of God, right? So it struck me as a uniquely interesting thing to hear them say, okay, so children are kind of excluded from this relationship rather than a piece of it. And I was thinking about how that plays out if that's a bedrock down the road. I do think you have a way to then tell yourself when things don't work out the way you envisioned. That is the primacy of the relationship you've primarily invested in, is your marriage relationship and your parental authority. So you still have both of those things, no matter what happens. And maybe the idea of the children's presence is optional. I don't know. I'm speculating, but it's interesting to think how those messages add up over the years in a way that when you add into that sunk cost fallacy and shame and all the other things that I think keep parents in particular from the ability to reckon with the fallout of these kind of teachings, I don't know. It's difficult. It's a uphill battle, I think, to really be able to listen and reevaluate and reconsider.
Yeah, I think that's right. I always come to the ends of these conversations. I'm like, why don't we think of a nicer, more uplifting way to end? But they always end on a real downer.
It's so sad. But I'm trying to think if there's anything, I don't know. If you're interested in going deeper with this, I am doing a deep dive on it. And I have little pictures from the children's manual that the children got during the session time. Some of them are cute, funny. I don't know. Maybe that's uplifting. It's hard because there's not a lot uplifting about it, I think. Especially these ones that are so heavy-handed. And it's not like there's nothing good in these or nothing of merit in these resources, but it's such a net negative that I think it's hard not to end us on a downer.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's right. I suppose I can end by acknowledging that both of us have had a unusual amount of background noise
Right, you
this
probably
time.
heard children in the background. So we've got them. Mine are busy learning to braid today. So they're braiding
Oh,
yarn. So
exciting.
they're popping in and showing me, having me
Yeah.
tie off knots. So it's a little, a
Yep,
little.
mine are playing hide and seek in the hallway outside here, so the slamming doors and running feet are, in case listeners you have not figured it out by now, usually we are recording with children at
Right. And
home.
now that it's summer, yeah, it's like daytime. When can our schedules collide? Well,
Yeah,
one thing we hope to do to intersperse some of these episodes is we do have interviews interspersing our discussions. So we
yeah,
hope you'll join us next time for an interview with a couple of authors. We think you'll enjoy that conversation, and it will be, I think, an encouraging one.
yeah, I think so too. So thanks for being with us, listeners, here in the church library. We hope you're having a wonderful summer, and we will see you next time.
We are so glad you've joined us in the church library today. This is Marissa Franksbert
And Kelsey Kramer McGinnis. And if you liked what you heard here, we think you'll be interested in reading our forthcoming book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families.
You can pre-order it now wherever books are sold, and it'll be on shelves in October of 2025.